Good evening. I'm Ann Walters Robertson, Dean of the Division of the Humanities, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of the Chicago program in Paleography and the Book, sponsored by the University of Chicago Division of the Humanities. Our acclaimed visiting professor from the University of Virginia, the renowned rare book scholar Michael F. Suarez, will speak this evening about how richly illustrated books delivered both cultural capital and political power in his presentation entitled The Book as Museum in 18th-Century Europe. But before we introduce Mr. Suarez tonight, allow me to mention briefly how he comes to be with us, not just as guest lecturer tonight, but specifically as part of the Chicago program in Paleography and the Book. And I will start by thanking the person who has made this annual lecture and the entire program possible, Hannah Holborn Gray, who conceived the initiative and has provided most generous support. I'm happy to say that we hope that Hannah will be with us this evening. She's not quite here yet, but I hope you will get to meet her and thank her yourselves. As she will recall, it was over lunch 3 years ago that she first suggested to me the idea of a course of instruction that would expose students to the study of manuscripts and books through time and cultures. As we tried to picture what this might look like, it emerged that an annual visiting professorship could serve our populations at the university well. Following this brainstorming lunch, I brought together a group of colleagues from across the humanities and social sciences divisions and the Divinity School, and together we talked about what the format for the instruction might be and selected our inaugural visitor. At that point, and unsurprisingly, the COVID pandemic delayed our moving forward. But here we are, finally, tonight, and we have very much enjoyed Michael Suarez's presence with us during the winter quarter. Now, I'd say it's no accident that the idea for the program came from Hannah Gray. Hannah is the Harry Pratt Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of History, and as you all know, she served as president of the University of Chicago from 1978 to 93. Hannah is a historian with special interests in the history of humanism, political and historical thought, and church history and politics in the Renaissance and Reformation. Given her expertise, it's clear why the early histories of printing and of the book figure prominently in her scholarship, and we're enormously grateful to Hannah for sharing her love of the book with us through this new program. Now, the Chicago program in Paleography and the Book aims to bring to campus an outstanding guest professor for 1 quarter each year, who specializes in areas such as manuscript history and reception, paleography, epigraphy, philology, codicology, and the history of the book and readers, and the evolution of print culture. In addition to offering a lecture to the public, each guest professor teaches a course and presents workshops on subjects related to their scholarly expertise for graduate and advanced undergraduate students. The program reflects the commitment of the University of Chicago and the Division of the Humanities to the proposition that a thorough understanding of original sources, the languages in which they were communicated, the means through which they were presented, and the contexts in which they arose are the indispensable tools of humanistic inquiry. Now, this commitment reverberates throughout the Humanities Division and its history, in the division's production of outstanding critical editions, in the belief in the importance of studying and preserving languages, no matter how remote, and in our insistence that scholars and students must have a deep command of and respect for the primary sources and the conditions under which they were created. Understanding the history of what we might call the visible word in all its forms is integral to this conception of humanistic learning and research. And yet, I think it's fair to say that these areas of study are too often neglected in university curricula today. This history, after all, encompasses venerable scholarly fields ranging across peoples and epochs, such as manuscript studies of the Bible and its reception, papyri in ancient Mediterranean civilizations, manuscripts in Sanskrit, Tamil, and many other languages and dialects, illuminated manuscripts of the medieval era, the development of printing and the flowering of print culture, and the practices of readers, to name just a few. Through the Chicago program in Paleography and the book, we aim to help these areas thrive. And once again, for her brilliance in suggesting and supporting us in this endeavor, we thank Hannah Gray. Before Michael Suarez begins his fascinating lecture, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Eric Slaughter, Associate Professor of English, Deputy Dean in the Humanities Division, and Master of the Humanities Collegiate Division. Since 2008, Eric has directed the Carla Shearer Center, a hub for the multidisciplinary study of American culture at the University of Chicago. As the creator of the Shearer Center's multidisciplinary seminars, Eric has brought together grad students in the humanities, social sciences, divinity school, and law school to learn from Americanist faculty university-wide. His scholarship focuses on transformations in political thought and behavior during the 18th century. His award-winning book, The State as a Work of Art, The Cultural Origins of the Constitution, explores the relationship of culture to politics in revolutionary America. Like Michael Suarez, Eric embraces books and original source materials in his scholarship, and his passion makes him the ideal person to introduce our speaker. Please give a warm welcome to my distinguished colleague, Eric Slaughter.
Thank you, Dean Robertson. I've warned Michael that a traditional full-dress Chicago-style introduction is often one that challenges in length the actual lecture it tries to introduce. And I've promised him that I wouldn't do that. So I'll just need about 40 minutes. The committee Dean Robertson charged with finding an inaugural visiting professor in paleography and the history of the book hailed from different departments in the humanities and social sciences, as well as from the Divinity School and the Hannah Holborn Gray Special Collections Research Center at the library. It included experts in a variety of fields, periods, geographies, and texts, scholars who study the compositional history of the Hebrew Bible, Greek and Coptic papyrology, religion, law, and government in the ancient world, Roman political thought and its reception over the past 2,000 years, the history of books, libraries, and the movement of scholars in 9th century Europe, medieval Tamil literature and epigraphy in southern India, Latin and vernacular music of the late Middle Ages, art, science, and law in early modern Europe, Persian paleography and codicology, and the translation of Middle Eastern literature in the West. Renaissance readers of Lucretius and censorship and information control from the printing press to the internet, the media history of the Protestant Reformation, print in the scientific revolution, the histories of intellectual property and piracy from Gutenberg to Bill Gates, and the social and environmental history of books in early America. The university has always been home to scholars interested in the production, transmission, and reception of texts, and this exciting new initiative has brought us all together and given us the chance to explore what the history of the book has been, is now, and can be at the University of Chicago. In the end, as we learned about new directions and exciting scholars in each other's fields, we on the committee were able to discover consensus around a scholar of 18th and 19th century British poetry, who, in his scholarly capacity, has helped to give shape through large-scale collaborative publishing projects to an integrated global history of the book, one that speaks meaningfully to our diverse fields. And who, moreover, in his administrative capacity, has overseen the expansion of a major institution dedicated to training a new generation of scholars in critical bibliography in all fields. It is thus my great pleasure to introduce our lecturer today. Michael Suarez, S.J., is a university professor and director of Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. In addition to this position, overseeing one of our nation's great institutes for the study of manuscripts, books, and digital materials, he has taken on leadership roles on big editorial projects, serving as co-editor of the 9-volume collected works of Gerard Manley Hopkins, as co-general editor of the 23-volume Oxford edition of the writings of Alexander Pope, and as the editor-in-chief of Oxford Scholarly Editions Online. Working with an international team, he has helped to produce the monumental 2-volume Oxford Companion to the Book, as well as an abridged version called simply The Book, A Global History. And in addition to all of this, in his free time, I guess, he has served on a variety of governing boards and for institutions ranging from the Library of Congress to Yale, and was nominated by President Obama to the National Council on the Humanities. We are extremely lucky that Michael is teaching on our campus this quarter, leading a course for 25 students in special collections called The Printed Book in the West, Evidence and Interference from Bibliography and Book History. This course began remotely back in January with an investigation of the library's copy of a 1483 Venetian printing of St. Isidore of Seville's Etymologies. Went in person with a week dubbed Euclidorama, in which students examined 19 printings of Euclid produced between 1482 and 1705, and have now reached Michael's sweet spot in the late 17th and 18th centuries, examining books like Newton's Principia, Johnson's Dictionary, the Encyclopédie, and Phyllis Wheatley's poems. They are working their way, as all courses should, toward the illustrated Rockwell Kent edition of Melville's Moby Dick, produced in Chicago in 1930. Anyone who has witnessed a lecture by Michael, either in person or remotely, knows that he is a mesmerizing speaker and one of the greatest evangelists for the transformational power of book history as an instrument of the humanities and of wonder in general. He has delivered some of the field's premier lecture series, such as the Lyle Lectures in Bibliography and Book History at Oxford in 2015 on the topic of the reach of bibliography, or the Rosenbach Lectures in Bibliography at the University of Pennsylvania, which he gave last fall on the topic of printing abolition, how the fight to ban the British slave trade was won. Beyond these specialized lectures, he has also taken the opportunity afforded by a TED Talk called Glorious Bookishness to make his case more widely. If you've seen Michael's performance on the TED stage, you will not easily forget certain moments. The moment, 4 minutes in, when Michael narrates his seductive entry into the profession when he discovers every book is a communal object. The moment, 8 minutes in, when Michael tells us that it is okay to judge a book by its cover, and then slides his suit jacket over his shoulders in imitation of a brawny man from the cover of a romance novel. The moment, 10 minutes in, when Michael produces gasps from the audience as he pulls from his pocket a book produced during the Civil War. Or the moment, 13 minutes in, when the audience breaks out in applause after Michael reports what he overhears his UVA students telling their parents about their interactions with an early 17th century copy of King Lear in his class. Michael is a student of the book as an expressive form, as one of his own famous teachers put it. And the experts he assembled for the Oxford Companion to the Book treat the book as many things. If you are fortunate to flip through the physical pages of the 2 volumes or scroll through the ebook, you will learn about the book as an aesthetic artifact, the book as a commercial object, the book as a concept, the book as an essential object of study, the book as a form, the book as an intellectual and ideological project, the book as an instrument for self-improvement, the book as a research tool, the book as sacred, the book as symbol, the book as a talismanic and powerful object, the book as a work of visual or tactile art, the book as a vital part of the academic, scientific, and commercial life of Britain, the book as a bulwark against spiritual decline and secular democracy in the United States, and finally, the book as we know it, which is a thing that has apparently been under threat ever since it was invented. You will not, however, find the book as museum there, which is the topic of his talk today. Please join me in welcoming Michael Suarez.
How very kind you are, Eric. What a pleasure to be here. I have so enjoyed my time at the University of Chicago, and I am willing to put the students in my class against the students in any other course at any other university for their enthusiasm, for their engagement, for their intellectual generosity. They have been an absolute joy to teach. So if I come here today, I come here partly enlivened by their intellectual energies. I'd like to speak to you today about the book as museum in 18th century Europe. And I feel really embarrassed to be the inaugural post holder in paleography and the book. For you see, I was in the very last class that the great paleographer Malcolm Parkes taught at Oxford University. At the end of his 40-year career, a man who wrote a famous book on the history of punctuation called Pause and Effect. Malcolm Parkes, in the 40th class he taught, had Michael Suarez as a student. So he was in a particularly excellent position to judge the truth of the fact that I was not merely the worst paleographer in that cohort, I was the absolute worst paleographer in the 40 years of his teaching career. So the profound irony of my being in the position of paleography in the book is best illustrated by my performance on the required 2-hour final exam, in which we were given an early secretary hand commercial document to create a diplomatic transcription of and to comment on the ductus. And with about 5 minutes left, I knew I was in deep, deep trouble because nothing was making any sense. And then suddenly, it hit me. The man in question in this commercial document wasn't buying a house, he was buying a horse. And at the very last minute, as the examiner was beginning to collect the exams, I crossed out house every time and wrote horse, 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 horse. And I was able to proceed to the degree. The committee chose badly, but here we are, we're stuck with it, we must go on. So printing is the art that preserves all other arts, and I have the privilege of talking with you today about 3 books. 3 books, each of which is a milestone in the history of bookmaking in the 18th century, each of which is astonishingly beautiful, each of which chronicles a liminal moment in the history of collecting in Europe, and each of which is a representation of a collection of objects, but the book itself is a supremely important object in intellectual and cultural history. And crucially, each of these 3 books is remarkable in that it leads to the production of multiple, indeed the proliferation of multiple other objects. So the book that is itself an object that's all about the representation of other objects leads to a kind of efflorescence of the very thing it represents in all 3 cases. Let's have a look. This is our first book, ladies and gentlemen. This is a representation of William Hamilton's vase collection. Okay, and here you see the title page of volume 1, English on the one side, French on the other side. Hamilton, Sir William Hamilton, is the envoy extraordinary to the kingdom, as you know, as you can see here at Naples. And he has this remarkable collection of what he believes are Etruscan vases. And here's how the book starts out, with a kind of a dedication to George III, who George always called him his foster brother. They were playmates as children. Quite possibly George II was William Hamilton's papa, but that's a story for a different day. Let's just suffice it to say that William Hamilton's mom was a favorite of the king. So this book is monumental. The historiated capitals were manufactured in Venice. You can see the leading here, and these beautiful, beautiful plates that are in the text. Everywhere, it seems, in the letterpress, there are these magnificent illustrations in this oversized folio. In the second volume, the style changes a little bit, but nonetheless, this monumentality perdures. And what the book is most famous for is for the hundreds of hand-colored ochre and black illustrations, which are idealized representations of the paintings on these so-called Etruscan, we now know Greek vases. And this book immediately attracted the attention of Western Europe. It became, as Hamilton intended, a kind of a pattern book for artists and artisans. And you can understand why the gravitational pull of its aesthetic is, in my view, quite remarkable. The treatment of the vases themselves, however, should not be overlooked. These engravings are really aesthetically very pleasing and quite remarkable, and something that has not been adequately discussed, it seems to me, is the way that each vase is accompanied by a kind of almost architectural drawing in which these very careful measurements of the object, the attention to the object itself, is delineated throughout the volume in a very meticulous way. So we have the vase, the kind of architectural plan of the vase, if you will, and then the painting of the vase in a somewhat idealized way. This is the pattern throughout all 4 volumes-ish. So it's hard to resist the illustrations of the book, and this is why the book was so deeply prized. And the book was, the factotum of the book, if you will, was a man named Hughes, who decided Hughes was too common a name. His father was a bankrupt cloth merchant, so he decided instead he would be Baron d'Arcanville, and so he was. And that's how he signs his name in the book, and that's how people style him today. But he undertook the making of the book for Hamilton. And he was, ladies and gentlemen, if I may say, a rapscallion. So this book proceeds by a typical subscription. All 4 volumes are promised for 1766. The first volume is delivered in 1767. The next volume is dated 66. It's delivered in 70. English subscribers do not get volumes 3 and 4 until the 80s. I've seen the irate correspondence in the Public Record Office in Kew. So I can testify to this, okay? This goes incredibly badly. D'Arcanville becomes insolvent and he mortgages the plates before the second volume is printed. He mortgages the plates and he gets out of town. Hamilton doesn't really understand what he's doing and why he runs out of town. He thinks this is because of a fiscal problem. I am here to tell you today that every time d'Arcanville gets in trouble, he has a really interesting way of raising a little cash. He publishes antiquarian pornography. And I could not have made that up. That's what he does. That's his kind of cash cow. And here are 2 examples. Now, Dean, I need to tell you, I'm only showing the title pages today, okay? I promise there will be no show and tell. However, if you'd like to take out your iPhone and take a picture of these 2 titles, you can certainly find these on Gallica. So here we are. But But he's a pornography publisher, which people who are really interested in the book that started the vase craze, the book that kind of is the parent of the neoclassical revival in Western Europe, they prescind from this. And I kind of understand why. It's not the best history. So there was a big English subscription list. The book was wildly expensive, and as you can see from this one of many comments, people felt they loved the book. They thought it was one of the most beautiful books ever made. They did not like the price, and they felt imposed upon because Hamilton was the foster brother of King George, and so they felt that they had to subscribe to the book, and that created a kind of friction, if you will, but it sure helped to move the book. The book has remarkable distribution throughout Western Europe, and in fact becomes a pattern book for the making of all sorts of Etruscan aesthetic permutations. So here we have 1802 in Potsdam, the Etruscan room. Here we have remarkable Josiah Wedgwood gets one of the very first copies, and he renames his new pottery Etruria, okay? And he makes this first day vase. The arts of Etruria are reborn because he has volume 1 of the vase book. And so he starts to be in the business of making Etruscan black and red vases. And this is how it starts, ladies and gentlemen, and it keeps going. And it keeps going. And this is how Wedgwood develops his distinctive brand. It's through D'Arcanville/Hamilton's first volume of the vase book. So some people cynically say that this beautiful 4-volume work is actually a sale catalog. Because as you will know, Hans Sloane, the founding of the British Museum and so on and so forth, the British Museum violates its bylaws to spend public monies, £8,800 or 8,000 guineas, to buy the vase collection of Sir William Hamilton. Completely against the law, but they do it, and those beautiful vases you see when you visit the British Museum, those are the ones that were his. Those were the ones that he collected. Those are the ones that are largely depicted in this book. So there are other antiquities that Hamilton collected, and Hamilton becomes resolutely identified with this book as well as with Vesuvius, which you can see in the background, and many of you will know the Fields of Fire book, which comes after this. But even here you can really see he's got the book in his hands, he's got the vase down below, he's got the vase next to him. You know, Joshua Reynolds wants to make sure you don't miss the point, right? This is the father of the vase craze in Europe, and the agency of that in many ways. Now, were people interested in neoclassicism beforehand? Of course. Of course. Were some people collecting vases beforehand? Absolutely. But this book has a kind of propulsive force, I submit to you, particularly by getting it into the hands of people like Wedgwood and Flaxman, who are artisans and manufacturers who really start to have this Etruscan/Greek art reach the masses. So the preface to the book says this book should become a pattern book for manufacturers. And so it does. And the correspondence between Wedgwood and Hamilton is actually quite revealing on this score. But this leads to a proliferation of a kind of aesthetic in the design of rooms, in the design of vases, in the design of furniture that is indeed thoroughgoing. I promised you that the book led to the production of other objects, and so it has, but it also led to the production of many, many other books. Oftentimes, books that are merely reprintings of the Hamilton book itself, like these beautiful volumes. But also, I became really perplexed when I was in the National Gallery in Washington and I came across this album. This is manuscript here, and I couldn't understand what was going on. And as I looked through the pages, this is why the digital is always necessary but not always sufficient. As I went through the pages, I discovered that each one of these was a cutout, hand-colored, and pasted in like a scrapbook. That these were actually applied to the substrate. And what did I discover? I discovered that one of the ladies in waiting in the course from the court of Louis XVI was exiled in Italy, and she was cutting up vase books and making a scrapbook for every museum that she visited. She was creating her greatest hits list with the help of a professional scribe and a professional colorist. Quite remarkable, really. The book runs and runs, as you can see. That's clearly a d'Ancarville drawing, a Hamilton drawing, as is that. It gets reprinted again and again and again. Here, you know, Kirk is saying, yeah, it's 1728, and we've got Hamilton. And again, Henry Moses, his own vases. So there's a lot of imitation. So when we want to understand what is the book, we always need to understand that objects make their meanings in relation to other objects. We always need to understand that print breeds print. And in this case, print creates a kind, or at least helps to foment, let's say. I don't want to accord too much agency. Helps to foment an aesthetic movement that leads to a commercial culture for the consumption of this aesthetic. And a major motive force is this d'Ancarville, Hamilton, 4 volumes of vase books, particularly those first 2 volumes, particularly volume 1. I'd now like to turn to our second book, the Museum Florentinum. The Museum Florentinum, and we'll concentrate today just on the first 2 volumes. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going back in time, not in the 1760s and 70s anymore, but to 1731, 1732. And these first 2 volumes are dedicated, as you can read here, to the gems of the Florentine community, the engraved gems. This, for some of you, will be a new kind of artistic and aesthetic category, but was extremely important in the 17th and 18th and into the 19th century. So here is a little emblem. You see that Fortuna, as is traditional, is carrying her cornucopia and has her gubernaculum, the rudder here, to guide fortune. And yes, to lasting fortune, hurrah. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, what's happening in Florence in the autumn of 1731, even as this book is being published? 6,000 troops have marched into Florence because the succession of what's going to happen to the decaying empire of the Medici is being settled, right? And this won't be settled for a very long time, and eventually Austria-Hungary takes possession, but the chattels are preserved in the Uffizi and the Pitti Palace, right? Let's be grateful for that. And I submit to you that the inventory and display of these 12 volumes of the collections of the Medici and the other great families of Florence, the Museum Florentinum, will be instrumental in preserving this cultural inheritance. But here we see the dedication to the last of the Medici, very sad in many ways. He's very mindful that he'll be the last. And importantly, when we get to the end of the book, we see sumptibus, funded by, however we want to think about that, the nobility of Florence. So what's happening here in this book, funded by, under the auspices of the great nobility of Florence, who are increasingly under threat and have commissioned one of the great antiquaries, one of the most learned men in all of Italy, himself a Florentine, to create this magnificent 200-plate, 2-volume, large folio book representing intaglios and cameos from ancient history. And this book, too, in a very different way, is incredibly beautiful and incredibly, if you will, resonant of the past. And I might add, beautifully organized, and is dominated, as you might imagine, by the Medici collections, but they take great care to represent the other great Florentine families. 1,218 gems. You see the gabinetti here, remarkably wide continental circulation. The book is given as a gift. The book enters the book trade, and it runs and runs. So this is the nature of the project of the Museum Florentinum. Gori, okay, he's the great antiquary, the great learned man, and he's going to do the gemmi, the statues, and then he's going to do the numismatic volume as well. And each one of these in its own way helps to keep integral the collections of Florence. So here's the perpetrator, here's the genius, here's the winner of patronage, here's the chap who's in the right place and the right time, and I submit to you, very, very likely, given his remarkable ecclesiastical and secular connections, the one who was commissioned precisely to undertake this project, Sumptibus of the nobility of Florence, at the very moment when the existence of these noble families as great households and their collections is under threat. This book leads to a revival, not a new interest, but a revival of interest in engraved gems from antiquity. It starts a new impetus, if you will, in the 1730s, 40s, 50s, 60s, right through in continental Europe and in Great Britain for the study and production of intaglio gems. So meanwhile, Gori continues on. The Museum Cortonese, another gem book, an individual collector. The one book begets another book. The Gemmi Anticae of Zanetti, a truly great collector. Here you see one of the probably the most distinguished of all the Zanetti Gemmi. Here, this beautiful gem, this cameo that ends up with Marlborough, and we can trace the provenance of this pretty well. But I don't just want you tonight to see the remarkable engravings. That would be sad. I want you to see what the engravings are representing and to have some understanding of the power of these objects and why they were found to be so mesmerizing by the publics who attended to them. So here you have the Dactylotheca Smithiana, again, Gori's last published project. 2 volumes. And one of the really interesting that happens with these intaglio gems is that casts are made of them. And so these are sold in sets. And here is a set that made its way to Budapest in the 18th century of the Dactylotheca. And you can see, you can make these paste casts. And once you've made a very good cast, you can make a cast of a cast, and pretty soon you can, as it were, as they used to say in my childhood on the cereal boxes, collect the whole set. So this is what happens. Please understand the nature of the containers for these Dactylothecae. what do you see? The book as museum in a different way, yes? Which seems pretty interesting to me. Again and again, these gem cases, unlike, say, coin cases, again and again, these gem cases are traditionally books, and they're marketed as books because why? These gemmi are thought of as a kind of text. These gems are themselves an unassailable text from antiquity. We need to think about how gems and metals are prized and how gems and metals make up part of the antiquary's library because they're seen to have a certain quality of being incorruptible, unlike, let's say, the transmission of a manuscript. For example, this idea of the dactylothecae in the book form is not invented by the 18th century in any way. Here we see in the very first year of the 17th century, we see the great collector here in Antwerp is using these book-like cases to store his gem collection. So, if you went on the grand tour like any good educated European gentleman would, they would be trying to sell you casts of these gems. And guess what? You would bring them home. And you would bring them home because everybody was bringing them home. You were bringing them home to your house in Paris, in London. Why? Because this was the souvenir, the thing that helped you not just remember, but also the thing that helped you have contact with the past, the cast of the gem. So Goethe himself says, I've just bought a collection. Young Goethe is in Rome. I just bought this collection, 200 impressions. I bought an established set here, and he says, they're unusually fine and distinct. I could not have come away from Rome with anything more precious. That's an astonishing statement, right? That's an astonishing statement. It's like using these gems to print something in paste, as it were, right? Not to denigrate it, and to say, this is the most precious thing because this is my portable, my take-home ability to have possession of antiquity. Quite remarkable. What's that about? That's pretty interesting. Along comes on the scene James Tassie and a number of other allied makers. And they not only become ultra refined in the art of making casts, they also become very important characters in the art of making cameos and intaglios themselves. And Tassie here in his portrait is holding one of his great cameos. Here's one of his sets. And you may think, oh, well, yes, this is just a copy of a copy. But Catherine the Great of Russia didn't think it was nothing. She thought that this was a really important way to have access to antiquity and to study antiquity. And she did collect the whole set. 6,000 of these at the time of the Tassie catalog. Every one that he had made at that point, she bought a copy of. Quite remarkable. By the time he publishes his complete catalog, that's swollen to 15,000 gem impressions. So print breeds print. Gem impressions breed gem impressions. Fashion for antiquity breeds a fashion for antiquity. These are kind of almost like contact relics, if you will. These are kind of like secondary printings of original artifacts. And of course, Wedgwood gets involved in this too. How could he not? Good businessman that he is. And he teams up with Tassie. He knows a thing or two about porcelain. He knows a thing or two about jasperware. And he gets in the business of making these, and some rather handsome ones too, it seems to me. And some really garish and ugly ones as well. So this becomes part of the social life of the nobility, the intellectual life of the nobility. I submit to you, look at Joshua Reynolds' painting of the 4th Duke of Marlborough and his family. Looks pretty ordinary, right? Check it out. Look at the detail. The son, who's carrying on the family's line, is carrying what? He's carrying the dactyloteca. He's carrying the book as museum in a different sense. And Papa is carrying Divus Augustus, the best gem they have in their collection at the moment. So when they sit for Reynolds, this is a highly engineered photo, if you will. It's a highly orchestrated photo. And to have the boy carrying the patrimony, the symbolic patrimony of the family, the contact with antiquity, the sacrum, that somehow makes the inheritance of this family sacred, touched by the genius of those who have gone before, who were masters in civil law, so they think, who were masters in the public polity, who were masters of virtue. The world, if you will, of Aristotle and the Nicomachean ethics is what this boy has under his hand, what this man carries in his hand. The glory of Rome. That's what you're supposed to read. Now, you could say, oh, pshaw, it's not true. That's not important. What's important is this is how they staged themselves for the world. And that's consummately important. So I'd also submit to you that the portability of these gems adds to a kind of associability. Unlike Roman statues, you can put them in your pocket. You can carry them across borders. They become comestible in a pretty interesting way. My favorite gem book is done with stipple engravings toward the end of the century, and I find these remarkably resonant and haunting. Changes in the technology, improved changes in the transmission of the beauty of the original artifact. How felicitous for us and for them. It all starts, in this case, with Gori. Not the first one, certainly, but because he has the Medici name, because he has the Medici Bank, because he has the distribution network, because it's this massive project, the Museum Florentinum, this has a socio-cultural, aesthetic, ethical impact, I submit to you, that becomes really significant. The book itself is beautiful and winning, and that makes a great difference, but it's not only that. It's the way that the book leads to the production of other objects. Not alone. There are other books. There are other makers. But if we want to look at the kind of arc here, you cannot avoid the Museum Florentinum. And of course, it gets copied and copied and copied in both authorized and unauthorized. Well, Gori's name is never mentioned here, because why would you? He's dead, and there's no intellectual property regime. So my third book that I'd like to talk to you about today, we're going back in time, as you will have noticed, is a book that bears the date 1702, but is a long time making. And here we see the Medallic history of Louis XIV. This is the only official history of the king ever published in his lifetime, and it turns out to be a history in medals. And this book is a tremendous milestone in bibliography, tremendous milestone, if you will, in a certain kind, maybe retrograde too, in a certain kind of historiography. So here you see, for example, the coronation of the king, and you can see these beautiful borders, this special type, the remarkable leading, the depiction of the medals, you can see the plate mark here, and so on. This is a very important book. In this 1702 folio instantiation, a new type is made, is founded, 286 medals. A new printing press is devised to create better impressions. because they're so worried about plateware, they make 177 separate plates just for the decorative fleurons. Can you imagine? They make 1,193 copper plates in all for this book because they keep switching them out to make sure everything is fresh, to make sure that the bite of the plate is perfect. And we have these records, fortunately. We have these records, I remember they're in the Arsenal, the book is in a presentation binding. You cannot buy the folio originally. It's only for presentation. It's only for a gift from the state. The book is made to give away. The book is made to confer a kind of a blessing, a beneficence upon you, that you can be the inheritor of the history of this great king. Hubristic? Sure. Remarkable publishing project? You bet. So this is my favorite of all the episodes. The king is accessible to all his subjects, naturally. But the reason why I've shown it to you is because of what you can see. Do you see the plate? Do you see the plate mark here? See the plate mark here? You see the plate mark here? You see the plate mark down here? Right? Yes? See that? Okay. See the relief type? The Roman de Bois? Right? Okay. This piece of paper had to go through the rolling press at least twice with perfect registration, and then had to go through this newly invented columnar common press to get this page, right? So the reason why they're making more than 1,000 copper plates, in part, is because they want everything to be perfect, but also because of the pressure of getting impressions like this is extremely damaging to the plates, and they want to make sure in the rolling, or some of you will know it as a star press, they want to make sure that this intaglio printing is to the highest standard that's available in the world. There was a very revealing preface that was suppressed because the king supposedly thought it was too self-aggrandizing. I don't believe that. I don't think there was anything for Louis that was too aggrandizing, but that's another story. But of course, he says that everything we've done here is to root what we're doing in the ancient, in antiquity. We are putting ourselves in contact with the virtue of antiquity. And these medals are made, please understand, throughout Louis's career, not just for the making of the book, but about 167 of these medals are made just for being included in the book. So you make the medals so that you can show them in the book, and then you could give the medals away or keep them yourself or whatever. So there's this really interesting aspect of making the artifacts yourself in order to display the artifacts in a form which is portable and in a form which you can write the explications for, so that you can be the master of the interpretation of the artifact, and therefore you can control the historiography of the reign. Do you see what's happening here? It's quite remarkable. So here's an interesting painting, and we see how from a very, very early age, Louis is learning about what kingship is and what the reign of the polity might be through medals, through the medallic cabinet that's in the king's possession. We're very, very fortunate that we have discovered, I had nothing to do with it, but about 20 years ago, all of these cabinets were considered lost, and one of them was found and has, as you see, been heavily restored. But it's quite remarkable that we know what Louis was using, and there were, I think, 32 of these. And the studies of these medallic histories and of the ancient medals was an extremely important part of his education. Here's the frontispiece to that 1702 folio. And here you see time, writing on the back of time. Time has been arrested by the metals. It's knocked over the hourglass. I find this a bit mawkish myself. And here we're designing new metals, and here's the metal press. Here, it's a bit of a cliche, but it tells you a little bit about what they want you to think they're doing. Bears no relationship in what they're doing at all, because they're not trying to stop time. They're not trying to arrest time. They're trying to unite a kind of Gadamerian fusion of horizons, if you will, but much more eisegesis than exegesis. What they're really trying to do, of course, is to confer the sacrum of antiquity upon the reign of the modern ruler, right? They're trying to sacralize the reign of the modern ruler, Louis, with the virtue, the virtuousness and the virtuosity, both, by going back to antiquity. And so you see something of this, I think, in the writings of Joseph Addison here. Cabinet of Metals is a body of history. To mint a coin was a kind of printing. Monuments, they're monuments consigned over to eternity. Right? This is quite remarkable. And it seems to me that in the writings of Addison, there is a kind of a conflation between the book and the metal, which is worth noting, except Addison will insist the metal perdures, the book is precarious. So we see right away from Louis' accession, here Venus, a little tribute to Anne. But he's already Apollo, and he's Apollo again. This time in full glory, just a few years later, and of course, this famous medal, he's Apollo again. The medals are teaching the king who he is and how he's meant to be. And the medals are teaching the ambassadors who come to visit and those who are privileged to visit Versailles what the proper image of kingship ought to be. You can hold it in your hand. You can send it to the Vatican. You can send it to London, to Buckingham Palace, right? You can do whatever you want with it because it's a portable commodity, but it eventually leads to the making of a book. So here you see again the victory at Beachy Head, and you see the Latin motto, and you know it's very good because the king has become Neptune, he's become a god, which isn't surprising. He's unable to be defeated by normal forces, and have you noticed? Have you noticed all of these medals are in Latin? Why? Because French is a modern tongue, and Latin is the mother tongue. And if you want the sacrum of antiquity, you can't be speaking French, thank you very much. You can give the explanations in French, but you sure as heck can't have the medals, which are meant to be establishing the emperor-like status of the king. You can't have the medals have any French on them at all, even though they're dated and are about contemporary events. This is altogether consonant with Louis' project overall, and you see this right from very early on, 1670. Louis turns 24. He has this little feast, and they're going to enact Roman parts, and sure, you're going to publish it in Latin, and you're going to have Roman games, and you're not going to be the roi, you're going to be the rex, right? You know, because why? Because you are the emperor who has not been seen since antiquity, right? Do you see what's happening here? This kind of self-fashioning and the making of books from when the king is 24 years old, the making of books to promulgate a kind of view of the universe, which we might find risible, but which people in their own time, some did, some satirized, but others found a really important form of political appropriation. Of course, the evening could not pass without there being a nefarious Jesuit at work. Or two nefarious Jesuits at work. Okay, and so here's the first of the nefarious Jesuits. who speeds the plow unwittingly by publishing himself a history of Louis in the monuments and medals and even the jetons, but he doesn't have any authorization from the palace. And when this book comes out and is so popular, this gets the people who are part of the glory factory moving. And so here you see members of the Petite Académie, some of whom you might recognize, people who are not very important culturally, like Racine and Boileau. But these are people who are manufacturing this antiquarian image of the king as emperor and who are preparing the making of the all-important folio. And fortunately, in the British Library, we have this remarkable test bed, the beta testing of different metals, the idea book, as it were, to see how are we going to play this? What do we need to do? And then finally, the book comes out in its beautiful edition binding with its remarkable borders. And you can see this is an incredibly beautiful book. The mise en page in this book is part of how it makes its culturally instantiated ideological meaning, yeah? This is pure ideology, but it's ideology married to aesthetics, married to history. And so that combination proves pretty potent. It's also true that at the same time in 1702, there is a quarto version, which is basically Honey, I Shrunk the Book. And the quarto version has the medals in their real size, does not repeat the obverse, and is for sale. It's a consumer object. And it's really the quarto that has a big impact for those who aren't members of the French nobility, nor in a position to be awarded the book by the king for services to the state. This book then runs and runs and runs. 1704, these are all unauthorized. 1705, German print in Baden. Pretty good job. The best one is the Amsterdam 1712. This is a beautiful, beautiful book to behold. And it's also true that just like the other books led to the production of objects, this book leads to the production of more medals, both legitimate hegemonic medals from other courts, but also leads to a kind of efflorescence of parodic medals too. And these parodies of Louis are partly in response to the outrageous cultural appropriation from the sacrum of history that's going on in these medals. So, of course, the king dies in 1715, and in 1723, a new complete folio comes out because it has to complete the story. Many of the explications are rewritten, and there are quite a few more medals. But there's a recycling here, as you might imagine, of the printing material that's been sitting around since 1702. So this is a kind of fiscal and cultural return on investment. This is a kind of maximizing a propaganda asset. And so it runs with not one but two medals struck to commemorate the death of the king, for example. And you can see even that the habit of medal collecting now becomes worthy of mockery by somebody like Alexander Pope, who says, "With sharpened sight, pale antiquaries pour the inscription value, but the rust adore." Right, the patina, right? But of course, it's because it's the behold, it's old version of the antiquary that Pope is here mocking. Of course, the succession of kings and not so kings in France now all have to make their medallic histories because Louis made his. And this runs, as I say, to the other European courts too. I submit to you, no Hamilton book, no neoclassical revival on the scale that we had, no vase craze, no ode on a Grecian urn by a ship's medic named John Keats. Everybody knows the first line of that poem. A lot of people forget the second line. Thou foster child of silence and slow time. For these books themselves, for all our jocular jesting about how they were made and the peccadillos of the people who made them, these books have themselves a kind of a ritual quality. A quality that takes itself very seriously at the time to say we in our modern times can only truly know antiquity, not through reading Livy and Horace and Virgil, my apologies to my classicist colleagues, but by thinking through objects. The antiquary thinks through objects, not through text. The antiquary, as Momiano tells us, assembles objects and lets those objects work in creative resonance with the beholder to understand the manifold virtue of antiquity, to let its beauty and aesthetic power take hold of the beholder and to have its transformative effect. I submit to you that the precursor of these books is not the Wunderkammer books that are so celebrated, and justly so. I submit to you that the precursor of these books are the books that come out of the ostentation ceremony, a Latin word which of course means the unfolding in order to show, but also has that sense of being ostentatious, right? And taking the relics, the holy objects out in the church or in the family chapel and showing them to the faithful who have eyes to see, becomes a central ritual in Europe, even as late as the early 16th century, and even in a place like Wittenberg. Remarkable. Here we see Frederick the Wise and his brother John the Constant. I think they might have been part of a basketball team, I'm not really sure, but Frederick the Wise and John the Constant are the patrons, and they themselves are on the cover of this book of relics. Not the church, not the patron saint, but the powerful, powerful political magus and his brother, who, as the first object, will show the contact relic, the so-called glass, it seems absurd to us, at least to me, of Elizabeth of Hungary, who is their canonized ancestor. And so by understanding the object and by thinking through the object, one understands the possession of an inheritance which is unassailable. This is the pattern and practice, it seems to me, of these three volumes that we've been looking at today, these three books, the patron saint, Bartholomew, here depicted, and the last, very last end of the ostentation book, the coat of arms of the ruler, the portability of political power, the portability of pedigree, the portability of a knowledge that you cannot assail because the knowledge comes from objects, not texts. And the objects themselves are, in the mindset of the book, eloquent of the sacrum of antiquity. This is how these books are doing their cultural work. This is the ceremony of political power. This is the ceremony of the knowledge of civilization that transforms men and women through its aesthetic greatness. It creates a kind of a sociability. It creates communities. Manuscripts are perishable. The written record of antiquity dies. The objects of antiquity continue. They continue through these books to teach us about the work of inventory, gathering, and ordering, but as Mary Carruthers reminds us, is also the work of inventio, of taking the assembled objects and of making something new. And these books partake of the work of display, which of course is concomitant with that idea of ostentation, to open up and roll out. But the word display, as so many of you will know, comes from the Latin word to disperse or to scatter. The books make antiquity portable. They make the greatness of history the possession of you and me. The gem engravings have their casts. And Goethe says, "There is nothing greater I could have taken home from the city of Rome." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this absolutely splendid lecture, which has shown us what a book can be and how vast its influence can be and what its progeny and its offspring can be. So thank you so much. And I would like we'd love to have some questions from the audience, and Michael will field them himself.
Please, Michelle.
Thank you so much. Is this on?
It is.
Okay. Thank you so much. This was just, I found thrilling, particularly the interaction between the reception of the object and as text and in relation to the text as object. I don't know if you can go back, but I was particularly fascinated by the medals that were satiric, and as it was this one and then the next one as well. So clearly these satiric medals are speaking the same language as the laudatory medals.
Absolutely.
Right? And so it has to, they're presumably circulating among the same set of people. And what jumped out to me as the classicist here is that the former one of the Phaethon is using the story from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and then the next one contains a citation from Horace from Epode 7.
That's right.
And so I'm wondering about this how they're using really the same objects, the same language to speak to one another. So who are these satiric medals for? What's the audience for these?
Yeah, so the satiric medals is a great question. And again, I had to elide a little bit. I want to be very clear, lest I be guilty of misleading you. The satiric medals exist before 1702, all right? Because remember, Louis is giving these medals away as gifts, right? And he's promulgating this image of himself as the Sun King, yada, 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 right? And so, so these satirical medals, for instance, exist in the Dutch court. That's the sort of epicenter of these satirical medals. And 17th century Dutch are masters of satire of multiple kinds. But they also exist in England, and they have a very robust, I mean, Louis hated in England, right? And so they have a robust circulation in the English court and among the English nobility. And the nice thing about that is we know that most of the people who are part of the English nobility, whether they went to Christ's or Eton, know who Horace is and have read Epode 7, right? So they get the joke, right? Part of what's so important about these books is that they work on multiple levels and they educate the viewer to understand the manifold truths of antiquity as they're being mediated through the book, through the objects, to the viewer, right? And so too with the medals. The medals are a kind of response against the Petite Académie, which becomes the Academy of Inscriptions, obviously. It's a pushing back against this outrageous, these outrageous claims that Louis is a Roman emperor, that he is Invictus, that he is, which was patently untrue, right? Patently untrue. But that somehow you would construct the history of Gaul as the history of the ancient empire, because there's a whole dynastic thing here going on that doesn't just say, these are my lands, but saying, I control human history. I control the destiny of men and nations like the Roman Empire. And I think that's what I mean, we're not so far from Gibbon, right? I mean, we're a generation away from Gibbon, and that's what people like Gibbon are going to find so repulsive about this kind of program. Right? It's the historiographical claim to control the narrative in such a narrow, what we would consider such a narrow and thoroughgoing way. But for my purposes, to create the objects, 163 of them, to put in the book because there are gaps and the book can't have gaps, so you go back and make the objects from when Louis was 28 years old, so that they can be in the book that you're going to distribute because that has the portability. That's a breathtaking thing, it seems to me. So the role of the book in the mind of the Academy is absolutely the linchpin of the project. And I think that we can't really understand the invention of a new kind of columnar press, the Grandjean type, the commissioning of the 1,100 copper plates. It's breathtaking. It's breathtaking. 28 different frames just to have an appropriate, pleasing fulfillment of the canon of variety in this folio. I mean, what's going on? What's going on is to say we control the aesthetic high ground, and therefore we control the moral high ground. And these medals will say over and again, you do not. Right? And many of these medals are deliberately, aesthetically kind of rough and ready, right? Because they're rejecting that kind of claim. Does that make sense, Michelle? Questions? Please, sir, with the hat.
Yes, I can project, but I'm not sure if I project.
Here comes the mic.
Thank you so much. So first of all, thank you so much again for an incredibly interesting talk. I was enthralled the entire time. I'm just fascinated.
This is my brother, by the way.
I'm a plant. I was fascinated by the sheer amount of copying going on, both from an original primary source, then into the book, then into copies of the book, then into copies of the copies of the book. And it seems incredibly interesting that you've got people who never would have seen this work of art if not for the copy of a copy of a copy that they would get. And yet, in the same way that you can't take a globe and flatten it without some sort of distortion, especially when you're going across media and then going from print to print to print, you've got to lose something that you have in the original. So I would love it if you could talk a little bit more about what's lost.
Sure. It's a great question. All remediation is lossy, right? All remediation and all copying is our very digital world is a domain of loss and gain, both, right? And you can't have just gain and you can't have just loss. It's always both, right? But there doesn't seem to be much of an acknowledgement of that, because when you're starving, half a loaf is not just better than none, it's infinitely better than none, right? So if you want contact with this cultural arc, and this is what you can get, you're not saying, well, I don't have one of the 200 presentation copies in red or blue Morocco. I have a quarto in calf. That's not what you're saying. You're saying, I've got the book, right? And then that's going to be copied and copied and copied and copied, some better than others, but always with some distortion, just as you say, I mean, extremely perspicaciously, right? But you don't see much commentary on the loss. You see lots of commentary on the kind of accessibility or availability. And one of the metaphors that's used again and again to justify this is, as the bee gathers from many flowers, so do I, ... right? So there's this kind of, there's this simile at work that's saying, hey, I could steal what I want to steal because this is a worthwhile project and I'm ultimately serving the public interest by delivering it to you, which is a deeply self-serving argument. But remember, there's no intellectual property regime, right? There is no intellectual property regime during any of this time that's international and that it crosses borders, right? So even within the same country, the idea of injunctions against intervening parties is almost unprecedented, right? So they can do this with impunity and they can turn a buck, and they do. But for us, bibliographically, this creates a kind of a surplus of meaning because we can see multiple copies from multiple countries and we can think about the loss and gain of textual and visual transmission. And I think that bibliography for a very long time has impoverished itself by only studying the transmission of the verba and not studying transmission of the res, right? Of not looking at the images and seeing the things and saying, let's look at textual transmission of images and fidelity of images. Because after all, like I didn't give you very much text, partly because it doesn't make a very good lecture, but also because the images sell the book. And that's a really important thing to remember. The images are what sell the book. And you can read the explanations or not. You can read Gory's erudition or not. But to have those 100 plates in each of the volumes with 1,200 gemmi, these beautiful gems, I mean, one could well, as I have, become lost in wonder at the beauty of this, right? And we don't want to lose the aesthetic dimension. But bibliography and book history need to find new and more rigorous ways, I think, using the digital environment to understand the vagaries of image transmission and not just textual transmission. Does that help a little bit?
It helps a lot. Thanks.
Okay, sure. Somebody else? Please, sir, in the back.
I think from your last comment, I understand what part of what your response might be, but I was going to ask, what's the provenance of these gemmi in Florence in the 16th, 17th century? And I guess I was going to say, were they really any good? And was anybody attacking this aesthetic or this meaning production that was coming out of kind of a commercialization?
That's a really great question. So, first of all, was the collection as vaunted as it is valorized? And was anybody objecting to this kind of commercialization? I don't know the answer to the second. I will say the answer for the gems and the metals And most of the Roman statuary, but not all, and remember there are only 50 plates in that, is yes, this is super high quality stuff. The last volumes of the Museum Florentinum, I'm ashamed to tell you, Gori's dead and moved, well, first he's moved on to other things, and of course, remember, Florence is falling apart, right? It's part of the Austrian Empire, right? And so the project loses momentum, and the last 2 volumes and the supplement, which is paintings of famous men, is garbage. Okay, so it's just garbage. So I would, if I stood here and told you that all 12 volumes were worthy of genuflecting before, that would be absurd, right? But I would say the 2 volumes of the gems, the 3 volumes of the numismatics, and the 1 volume of the statues, with a few marked exceptions, are really ultra high quality. And if you want to know, go to the Pitti Palace and the Uffizi, because mercifully, they're still there for the most part, which is kind of great, right? Although one of the problems about the gems is you can sell them, right? And they do, they sell a lot. Hamilton is a gem collector, not surprisingly. And Hamilton sells gems when he needs money. He does not publish pornographic antiquities when he needs money. He sells gems when he needs money because of their portability and because of their prize. There's a crest of the gem moment, and when he needs liquidity, there's a moment in his correspondence when he has to buy a certain woman, who you may figure out who she is. He has to buy a certain woman diamonds of the finest water, and it costs him 500 pounds in English money, which is rather a lot, and he sells gems. So there's this interesting circle of kind of nobility and informed collecting around the metals, around the gems, and they're fungible in a way that the paintings and certainly the statuary just certainly isn't. You can't really sell your buddy the Ishtar Gate, It just creates all sorts of problems. But yes, this collection is really quite remarkable. Now, of course, Cosimo Medici didn't do the buying, right? He had people, right? And for the most part, money wasn't an object. And they also deaccessioned a lot of things on the way, like a lot of collectors. They kept trading up. They would get rid of things that were. The documentation on the collection is pretty good, and the library of the Uffizi is exceptionally good. Sir.
Thank you. So I wonder, first of all, thank you for this exhilarating talk. It was one of the shortest hours that I can remember. I wonder whether you could amplify a little bit on when you talked about particularly the cameos. You talked about that they were sort of stamped or printed. And of course, the same applies to the metals to a certain extent, and in some sense, also the aesthetics of the vases that when they make their way to Wedgwood. And the reason why I'm asking, because you seem to make sort of make a connection to the printing of the book, and if you connect that to your sort of thesis at the end of the relic, as you probably know, Gutenberg's first venture was not the printing press, but creating
those mirrors
that captured the image. And so one way to think about it is that that the impression that these sacred images during the ostentation were they so to say formed or shaped the spectator, and they were captured in the mirror. So, I wonder whether there sort of an argument could be made that what you were, saying about sort of the sacramental representation of antiquity versus, the reliquaries could be, via sort of a kind of typographical mechanism, and whether you could talk a little bit more about sort of what you were trying to get at with the cameos.
Thank you. Yeah. So very perspicacious. So this whole talk really is about the difference between the singleton and the multiple, right? And it's about trying to find a way to obviate the problem of the singleton being located in a particular time and place and people not being able to have access to it. So what do? You reproduce it in a book. What do? You make a cast of it. What do? You get somebody to make a drawing of it and idealize it and put it in a brightly colored ochre and black frame, which never existed on any of those vases, but are absolutely part of the aesthetic, right? And if you take your copy of d'Ancarville and walk in to the British Museum and ask to see those vases, you will be really disappointed because they are idealized and cleaned up. Their cosmetic imperfections are completely eradicated, but also they are, to forgive the phrase, they are tarted up, right? They are made to suit an aesthetic that will resonate with the consumer base, right? But does that still not mean that in some ways they lead to the production of what we might think of broadly conceived? And again, I don't want to overextend the metaphor because it would be fatuous. But in some ways, like the reproduction of these metals, and in some ways the reproduction of these gems, is not just like the ostentation, this rolling out for display and having this idea of the dispersal, right? But I think also there is an element of the contact relic, right? I can't have, let's make it up. I can't have the ulna of Catherine of Siena, but I could have the cloth that touched the ulna of Catherine of Siena, right? So, I mean, again, to us that seems deeply bizarre, right? But I understand what the desire to take the singleton and to create a multiple from it is. And the powerful thing about the metals and about the gems, including the cameos, which are carved by hand, right? The original ones are carved by hand, but then you make the casts of them, and this becomes, to paraphrase Addison, a kind of printing, right? And so what you're trying to do is, you have this, I would argue, efflorescence, if you will, of access to antiquity, a deeply skewed and imperfect understanding of antiquity. They don't know any philology for a start. They know zero philology, right? So they don't know a lot, right? They don't know much about epigraphy. They don't know, Mabillon is doing what he's doing, but, it's a problem, right? But this is a great first step because the proliferation of these images and the multiplication of these objects, I would submit, is salutary development, not a vulgarizing development for the most part, because it enlivens people, I'm sorry to use the phrase, but to the pastness of the past and the possibility of a virtu to be recovered from that past, right? That kind of sacrum, that word that I use, kind of in a secularizing sense, but how can we know the past? We would say, I hope I know a little bit at the University of Chicago, we would say by reading the great texts, right? This is the tradition of the University of Chicago, although it happens to have pretty great archaeology too. But I think that there's this idea that and it's not true, but there's this dominant idea in the 18th century that the artifact cannot lie. And that becomes really centrally important in this idea of making the multiple from the singleton. Does that help?
Well, Michael has given us so much to think about, and I know we could go on for several hours, I think, but I would like to call a halt to this part of the lecture now and ask that we adjourn to the lobby where there's a lovely reception and that you continue to chat with Michael there. But first, if we could, let's thank Michael for really just a splendid, splendid lecture.